Have you ever noticed that some of your thoughts don't feel like thoughts at all, but feel like conclusions that have already been decided before you even had the chance to question them? As if your mind has already reached an answer, and you are simply becoming aware of it after the fact, without ever seeing how it formed? Those thoughts don't feel optional or flexible or open to interpretation. They feel immediate, solid, and final, like something you are supposed to accept rather than examine. And because of that, you don't pause, you don't question, you don't step back. You just move with them as if they must be true without requiring any verification. And that is where everything begins, not with the thought itself, but with your reaction to it. Because the moment something feels real, you stop observing it and start following it. And that shift happens so quickly that it feels automatic, like there was never a choice involved in the first place. So let me ask you something directly, and I want you to actually consider it instead of rushing past it. When did you decide that everything your mind tells you is true? Not occasionally, not when it makes sense, but instantly, without hesitation, without resistance, and without even a moment of distance? Because that is exactly what is happening. A thought appears, and you treat it like evidence, like something that must be pointing toward reality. But it is not evidence. It only feels like evidence. And feeling real is not the same as being true, even though your mind treats it as if it is. Have you ever felt completely certain about something? Absolutely convinced that you understood it clearly, only to feel just as certain about the opposite later on, without anything actually changing externally, without new information, just a shift in how your mind presented the same situation back to you? Same life, same environment, same conditions, but a completely different conclusion. And in both moments, it felt equally real, equally convincing, equally true. So which one was actually accurate? Because they cannot both be true at the same time, and yet you believe both without questioning them. That should tell you something important, not about the world, but about how your mind works, because you are not being controlled by your thoughts themselves. You are being controlled by how convincing they feel. And that feeling is not truth, it is familiarity built through repetition. You are not thinking as much as you think you are. You are repeating, and the repetition is what creates the illusion of truth. Because the more something appears in your mind, the more familiar it becomes, and the more familiar it becomes, the more natural it feels, and the more natural it feels, the less you question it. So now the thoughts that appear the most become the ones you trust the most. Not because they are accurate, but because they are repeated. And repetition creates certainty, and certainty feels like truth, even when it has never been proven or tested against anything outside of your own internal experience. Think about how often the same thoughts return, the same doubts, the same assumptions, the same quiet conclusions that feel like they are telling you something important, and yet they never actually lead anywhere new. They just bring you back to the same place, the same feeling, the same uncertainty. If your thinking was actually solving something, you would have moved on by now, you would have reached clarity, you would have found resolution, but you haven't. Because the system is not designed to resolve, it is designed to continue, to repeat, to reinforce what has already been established. That is why it feels like progress when it isn't. Because movement creates the illusion of direction, and your mind is constantly moving, constantly processing, constantly revisiting. But it is not moving forward, it is moving in circles, returning to the same material again and again. So now ask yourself something honestly. How many of your thoughts have actually created clarity, and how many have simply led back to themselves? Because if you pay attention, you will notice that most of what you think is not new, it is just familiar patterns repeating in slightly different forms. And familiarity is powerful, because it removes the need to question. It creates the illusion that something is already understood. It makes a thought feel complete even when it is not. And once something feels complete, you stop examining it and start accepting it without resistance. This is how a thought becomes something more than a thought. This is how it becomes something you identify with, something you assume is true, something you stop observing, because it no longer feels like something happening. It feels like something that simply is. Something that belongs to you. And once a pattern feels like identity, it becomes extremely difficult to challenge, because questioning it feels like questioning yourself. And most people avoid that entirely, which is why these patterns remain in place even when they are clearly limiting or clearly inaccurate. So now consider this carefully. What if a large part of what you think is not actually you? What if it is simply repetition that you have followed for so long that it feels personal? What if the voice in your head is not telling you the truth, but replaying what it has learned? Because your brain does not prioritize truth, it prioritizes familiarity. It brings back what it has seen before, what it has engaged with before, what has been reinforced, not because it is accurate, but because it is available. And what is available feels natural, and what feels natural feels right. And what feels right is rarely questioned, which means you are not evaluating your thoughts based on evidence. You are trusting them based on familiarity. And that is where the illusion becomes powerful, because now repetition is being mistaken for accuracy, and familiarity is being mistaken for truth. This is why anxiety feels real even when nothing is actually wrong. This is why doubt feels justified even when there is no evidence. This is why overthinking feels necessary even when it leads nowhere, because the feeling is strong, and strong feelings are often mistaken for truth. But strong does not mean true, and this is the part most people never separate. They assume intensity equals accuracy. They assume certainty equals correctness. But both of those assumptions are flawed because they are based on how something feels, not what it actually is. So now the real question is not how to stop thinking, because that is not possible and not necessary. The real question is why you believe everything you think. Because belief is what gives thoughts their power, not the thought itself, but your automatic trust in it. And the moment that trust weakens, everything begins to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but noticeably, because now a thought can appear without immediately controlling your reaction, without immediately shaping your perception, without immediately becoming something you follow. A thought appears, and instead of continuing it automatically, you notice it, not as truth, not as something that needs to be solved, but as something that has appeared. And that small shift creates something that did not exist before, which is space. And in that space, something important happens. You are no longer inside the thought, you are observing it, and observation changes the entire structure of the experience because you are no longer reinforcing it, you are no longer continuing it, you are no longer feeding it. And what is not fed begins to weaken. And this is where everything starts to shift in a way that most people never experience, because most people never stop long enough to see what is actually happening. They stay inside the pattern, inside the reaction, inside the continuation. And because of that, the loop keeps reinforcing itself without interruption. Because every time a thought appears and you engage with it, even slightly, even subconsciously, you are strengthening it. You are telling your brain that this matters, that this is relevant, that this should be brought back again. And your brain listens, not logically, but mechanically through repetition. So over time, the same thoughts return faster, stronger, and more frequently, not because they are true, but because they have been practiced. And practiced thoughts feel real, practiced thoughts feel automatic, and eventually practiced thoughts feel like they are part of who you are. And that is where the illusion becomes almost impossible to see, because now you are no longer experiencing thoughts as something that appears. You are experiencing them as something that defines you, something that represents your perspective, your identity, your understanding of reality itself. But what if that is not true? What if what feels like your identity is actually just repetition that has gone unobserved for too long, repetition that has never been questioned, repetition that has been reinforced to the point where it no longer feels like a pattern? It feels like something fixed and unquestionable. Because once something reaches that point, it becomes self-confirming. Everything you see begins to align with it. Not because reality is confirming it, but because your perception is filtering everything through it. And now you are not seeing clearly, you are seeing selectively. So now every situation, every interaction, every outcome starts to look like evidence, not because it is, but because you are already expecting it to be. And expectation shapes perception in a way that most people do not recognize because it happens automatically. And that is why the loop feels so convincing, because it appears to confirm itself, it appears to validate itself, It appears to prove itself over and over again, when in reality it is simply being repeated and reinforced through attention and interpretation. So now ask yourself something deeper. When you think something negative, are you discovering something about reality? Or are you reinforcing something that already exists in your mind, something that has been repeated so many times it feels like truth without ever being verified? Because that distinction changes everything. Because if you are reinforcing instead of discovering, then the problem is not what you are thinking. The problem is how you are relating to what you are thinking. And as long as that relationship stays the same, the pattern stays the same. And this is where most people get stuck, because they try to change the content of their thoughts. They try to replace them, suppress them, fight them, analyze them, fix them. But all of those approaches keep them engaged. And engagement is what keeps the loop alive. So the more you try to fix the thought, the more you reinforce it. The more you try to solve it, the more you stay inside it. The more you try to control it, the more attention you give it. And attention is what sustains it. So now the approach has to change. Not what you think, but how you relate to what appears. Because the moment that changes, the entire system begins to shift. When a thought appears and you do not automatically follow it, when you do not immediately react to it, when you do not treat it as something that needs to be solved, but instead recognize it as something that has simply appeared, you interrupt the pattern. And that interruption is small, almost unnoticeable at first, but it is enough. Because the loop depends on continuity. It depends on you moving from thought to reaction without interruption. And the moment that chain is broken, even briefly, the system begins to lose stability. And once stability is lost, control begins to weaken. Because now the thought is no longer driving the experience automatically. There is space. And that space is where everything changes. Because in that space, you are no longer inside the thought. You are aware of it. And awareness is what separates you from the pattern. Awareness is what allows you to see something instead of being carried by it. And once you can see a thought clearly, it loses something. It loses its authority. It loses its urgency. It loses its ability to dictate your next move automatically. Not completely, but enough to change your relationship with it. And that is where the shift becomes real. Because now your thoughts do not disappear, but they stop controlling you in the same way. They stop feeling absolute. They stop feeling unquestionable. They stop feeling like something you have to follow without choice. And instead, they become something you can observe, something you can recognize, something you can allow to exist without engaging with it. And what is not engaged with begins to weaken, because thoughts need attention to sustain themselves. They need continuation, they need reinforcement, and without that, they lose momentum. So now you are not trying to stop thinking. You are simply not feeding every thought that appears. And that changes everything. Because now the repetition slows, the intensity decreases, the urgency fades. Not because your mind is silent, but because it is no longer being constantly reinforced by automatic engagement. And as that happens, something else becomes available. Clarity. Not the kind that comes from analyzing everything, not the kind that comes from trying to figure everything out, but the kind that appears when unnecessary thinking stops. Because clarity is not created through more thought. It is revealed when the noise reduces. And the noise reduces when you stop feeding it. So now your experience begins to change in a way that feels different, less reactive, less pressured, less dominated by the same patterns. Because you are no longer reinforcing them in the same way. And from that position, your perception becomes clearer. Your responses become more intentional. Your actions become less automatic because you are no longer being driven by every thought that appears. You are seeing them. And once something is seen clearly, it cannot control you in the same way again. So now the next time a thought appears, and it feels real, and it feels important, and it feels like something you need to follow, pause for just a moment and ask yourself, is this actually true? Or is this just familiar? Because that question interrupts everything. That question breaks the pattern. That question creates space. And in that space, you are no longer inside the loop. You are outside of it. And once you step outside of it, even briefly, you realize something that changes everything. Your thoughts were never the problem. Your belief in them was. And once that belief is no longer automatic, once it is no longer unquestioned, once it is no longer immediate, the entire structure begins to collapse. Not suddenly, not completely, but gradually, because it is no longer being reinforced. And what is not reinforced cannot sustain itself indefinitely. And that is where the shift completes. Not when your thoughts disappear, but when they stop defining your experience. When they stop controlling your perception, when they stop directing your actions, because at that point, they become what they always were. Patterns, not truth. And that is the difference between being controlled by your mind and understanding how it works. And once you understand it, you stop following everything it tells you. And that is where real control begins. If you are working to understand your mind at a deeper level and step out of patterns that no longer serve you, consider subscribing to the Mind Refined.